So here we are at the final week. I have this sense for me, although I've enjoyed all of the topics that we've looked at and the texts that we've looked at over the course of the term, honestly, it kind of feels like saving the best to last. So I love talking about covenant, and I'm excited about talking about covenant in a context that is kind of outside traditional biblical studies. And hopefully some of the connections that I make will stimulate connections in your own thinking. There may be ways in which you agree, there may be ways in which you disagree, but I think it's going to be a fruitful kind of conversation as we talk about covenant. Now, for this week, the article that I asked you to read, I do understand that it's a little dated, but I think the concepts are such that it'll be a productive kind of article for you to read, and that's what I'm most interested in, is putting together readings and talks that are of benefit to you, the student, that help you think through issues as it relates to spirituality, ethics, theology, and how that impacts your practice area. So I have my lemonade. Let's get started. Why is covenant important? Why is it important for me to want to talk about covenant with you? Why is it important as we faculty were working on the course and scoping out these various weeks and their topics? Why was it important to talk about covenant, and what do I have to add to that conversation? For theology, some have suggested, specifically about covenant and the Old Testament, that covenant may actually be the central idea binding the Old Testament together. Now, that's a big, huge kind of statement. It assumes a couple of things. It assumes that A, there is a central theme throughout all of the Old Testament, and it assumes B, that central theme can be teased out and that we can actually identify it. One of the temptations when you talk about a central theme is to try to find it everywhere. And the fact is you can't. That's not the way literature works. It's certainly not the way that historical documents work. But you isolate snippets here and there and the other place and say, okay, I see this concept often enough that it seems to inform the thinking of the writers in such a way that it is a central kind of idea. One of the it's a kind of a little known book, but I think a helpful one, was written by a scholar named Elmer Martens, and in the mid 80s, and he contends that there is not a central theme in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament thematic development revolves around a core of several themes working together, working in tandem. I really like that idea. One, because I never like to be nailed down to say this is it and it can only be this thing. And two, that's my own kind of experience when I look at the text. Here are places where covenant is identified as being really, really important. Here are places where praise or worship might be really important. Creation language, salvation language. But all of that said, if there were one central theme in the Old Testament, covenant makes a pretty good case for itself, or one could make a pretty good case for covenant as being that central theme. It is that important, and it seems to be how God relates to humankind. It seems to be that God binds himself to humankind through this mechanism that we call covenant. And so one of the things that forces us to ask is this question: is a covenant and a contract, are covenant and contract, are they similar ideas? Are they different ideas? If they are different, what are the distinctions between the two? And I think that's important, honestly, for our society as a whole to answer as we think about the ways in which we relate to one another. But certainly it's important for a theology course in the Old Testament. It's important for, and then marrying those together, it's important for nursing practice. So it seems to me that today, and you may disagree with this, so have that critical thinking part of your brain working right now. It seems to me that today in the U.S., these two terms are often interchangeable. Now, I'm not saying they should be. I'm just saying I think they often are. But let me ask some questions. Is marriage a contract or a covenant? When you think about that binding together of two people, is the word covenant a more helpful explanation of what is going on there, or is contract a more helpful explanation of what's going on there? Think about friendship. Is friendship a contractual kind of relationship, or is it a covenantal type of relationship? Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, Dr. Ragsdale, I'm not even sure I understand the differences between a covenant and a contract just yet, so how can I really know? All I'm trying to elicit at this point is your own kind of ideas, how it hits you. Almost like the Rorschach test, right? The ink blot, what do you see? The first thing that comes to your mind. So kind of first thing that comes to your mind without a lot of explanation, marriage, friendship. Does the word covenant more accurately describe those kinds of relationships, or does the word contract more accurately describe them? Take a nurse, for example. Is the relationship a nurse has with his or her patients, is that more contractual or covenantal? Is the relationship that I as an educator have, even through the distance of this kind of online environment, is my relationship with a student to be more contractual or covenantal? Is the relationship that someone in law enforcement has, is it more contractual with the public or covenantal? And are there ebbs and flows in those kinds of relationship? So thinking about those questions, we then have to ask the follow-up question, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference if I think of my relationship with my wife as a contractual relationship as opposed to a covenantal relationship? Now, you may say, well, let's assume that a marriage is a contract. And you may say, well, let's assume that you think marriage is a covenant. And you may say it's a covenant. It doesn't matter what somebody else thinks about in terms of that particular relationship. It is a covenant. It is this thing. So thinking of it as this other thing, contract, is completely erroneous. But I would contend how we conceptualize ourselves and our relationships does make a difference in the way we react to other people, particularly those people with whom we are in relationship. So as you think about your own practice area, are you in a covenantal type of relationship with your patients? Are you in a contractual kind of relationship with your patients? And what difference does it make in terms of your own processing? So what are we going to do from here on out, the rest of the videos? Well, we're going to talk about some examples of biblical covenants. We're going to talk about some components of those covenants and the aim or the purpose of the covenant. We'll do the same thing with contracts. We'll talk about some contracts or some contractual kinds of experiences in the Bible, and then what are the components of that if we can identify any, and what's the aim of those contracts? And then we'll wrap it all up with a concluding lecture, and we'll call it a semester. All right? Be back in a minute.